Hey, amazing viewers, I love connecting with you all around the world. Stay with me until the end, because what I'm about to share will leave you inspired and ready to take control of your own life. In today's story, you'll hear about an incredible twist that no one saw coming. Also, if this is your first time here, press the subscribe button and join our incredible journey. The courtroom buzzed with anticipation, the murmurs of onlookers filling the air as they settled into their seats. The defendant, Theodore Dawson, stood at the center of the room. His dark sunglasses reflected the harsh lights above him, hiding his eyes, but not his presence. His calm demeanor contrasted the chaos that surrounded him. You wouldn't think a blind man could pose such a challenge to the entire legal system. Yet Theodore stood there, his voice steady, his confidence unwavering. "Are you telling me, Mr. Dawson, that you, a completely blind man, somehow managed to draft a legal motion that outmaneuvered not only the prosecution, but also my ruling and the entire legal system?" Judge Howard's voice echoed through the chamber, full of disbelief. He leaned back in his chair, his fingers tapping against the armrest in mockery. Theodore stood in silence, his expression unreadable, a slight smile tugging at the corners of his lips. His calm was unnerving, unsettling in a room filled with hushed whispers. "Your Honor," Theodore's voice was clear and controlled. "That is exactly what I am saying." A collective gasp rippled through the courtroom. The spectators were in disbelief. The idea of a blind man not only participating in legal proceedings but outwitting them was unheard of. Judge Howard chuckled, shaking his head as if to dismiss the idea entirely. "I've seen criminals try every trick in the book, Mr. Dawson." Judge Howard scoffed, his tone patronizing. "But this is a new one. A blind man outsmarting the entire system. Tell me, how is that even possible?" The prosecutor, Mr. Callahan, sat back, a smirk dancing on his lips. He glanced at the judge, then at Theodore, eager to see this charade unravel. The courtroom's attention was fixed on Theodore, expecting him to falter, to stumble in his defense, but there was no hint of hesitation. Instead, he stood there like a statue, his head slightly tilted as if he could see each person in the room, each one eagerly waiting for him to slip up. Theodore took a breath, his hands folded calmly in front of him. "I suppose, Your Honor, you'll just have to find out," he said slowly with a tone of quiet certainty. His words hung in the air, thick with suspense. Judge Howard's smirk faltered for a split second, and then, as if to break the tension, the courtroom door suddenly crashed open. The sound of it slamming against the wall echoed through the space, causing everyone in the room to jump. A man, breathless and disheveled, burst into the courtroom, clutching the thick stack of papers. "Your Honor," the man shouted, his voice full of urgency, "you need to see this right now." Judge Howard froze. His fingers gripped the edge of the desk as he felt a shift in the atmosphere. Something big was happening. What could possibly be in those papers? What was Theodore Dawson hiding? How had a blind man seemingly turned the system upside down? The man with the papers was barely able to catch his breath as he handed the stack to the judge. For a moment, the room was silent, the only sound the soft shuffle of papers as Judge Howard flipped through them. His brow furrowed, and then, with a shaky hand, he muttered to himself, This isn't possible." His voice was barely a whisper, and the room leaned forward, eager to know what was on those papers. His hands trembled as he set them down, his gaze shifting from the papers to Theodore Dawson, who stood unblinking, his face as still as a stone. "I don't know how," Judge Howard finally said, his voice filled with a mix of disbelief and awe. "But he's done it." The room went dead silent. The realization hung in the air like a heavy fog. What had Theodore done? How had a blind man, someone everyone thought incapable of navigating the complexities of the law, managed to outmaneuver the entire legal system? In the back of the courtroom, whispers started to spread. The tension was palpable. The prosecution's attorney, Mr. Callahan, was no longer smirking. His face had turned pale, and he quickly leaned forward, trying to get a glimpse of the papers, trying to understand what had just happened. "Your Honor," he asked, his voice shaky, "what is it? What's in those documents?" Judge Howard swallowed hard, his eyes wide, his fingers clenching the edge of his desk. I can't explain it," he whispered, his voice cracking with uncertainty. "But Theodore Dawson has just changed everything." The crowd held its breath, waiting for the next move. What was so groundbreaking about these documents? How had a blind man managed to bring the entire legal system to its knees? And what was the secret he held? The room was buzzing, a mixture of awe and confusion filling the air. But Theodore, unfazed, stood tall, that same unreadable smile on his face. He knew something the rest of them didn't. He was about to reveal a truth that would shake the very foundation of the case and perhaps change the way the world saw him. The judge stood up, his face flushed with emotion. "Clear the courtroom," he bellowed, his voice commanding. "Now." A collective gasp rippled through the room as the officers began ushering people out. The spectators, reporters, and everyone else in the courtroom were forced to leave, the doors slamming shut behind them with a finality that sent a chill through the air. The few remaining people in the room, Judge Howard, Mr. Callahan, Theodore, and his attorney, were now alone, the tension more palpable than ever. Theodore stood still, his posture perfect, his expression unchanged. As the last of the onlookers were escorted out, Judge Howard's gaze fixed on Theodore. How did you do this?" he asked, his voice filled with awe. Theodore adjusted his tie and looked straight at the judge. "I told you, Your Honor," he said smoothly. "You'll just have to find out." The room fell silent, and the truth, whatever it was, loomed on the horizon, just out of reach, ready to change everything. The courtroom was empty now, the silence suffocating. All that remained were the few who understood the gravity of what was about to happen. Theodore Dawson, the blind defendant, stood like a beacon in the center of it all, calm, composed, yet somehow terrifying in his quiet confidence. The once hushed murmurs outside the courtroom now seemed like a distant memory, drowned out by the heavy silence inside. Judge Howard, still holding the papers, stared at them with disbelief. His fingers trembled as if he couldn't quite bring himself to comprehend what was written on the pages. He looked up at Theodore, whose expression was as unreadable as ever. There was no smugness, no arrogance, just a quiet certainty that seemed to say, "I know something you don't." And that was precisely what unnerved Judge Howard the most. "How?" the judge asked again, his voice barely above a whisper. "How did you do this?" For a moment, Theodore didn't respond. He let the question hang in the air, allowing the tension to grow before offering a reply that sent ripples through the room. "I didn't do it, Your Honor," Theodore said softly, his voice smooth, almost casual. "It was never about what I did. It's about what was done to me." The judge blinked, his confusion deepening. What could Theodore possibly mean? What was the man trying to imply? "You see, Your Honor," Theodore continued, his voice steady but filled with an underlying force. "The system is built to favor certain people, people who have resources, power, influence, the things I don't have. But that doesn't mean I'm helpless. It just means I have to fight the only way I know how, by using what the system doesn't expect." Judge Howard frowned. "You're talking in circles, Mr. Dawson. What exactly are you getting at?" Theodore's smile was barely noticeable, but carried with it an undeniable weight. "What I'm saying, Your Honor, is that I've been underestimated my entire life. People have seen my blindness and assumed I was weak, but that has been my greatest advantage." The room was still. No one spoke, not even the prosecutor, who seemed to be caught in a spell of disbelief. Theodore's words were cutting through the layers of illusion that surrounded the case. Blindness, he implied, wasn't a weakness, it was a weapon. The judge was silent for a long moment, processing what Theodore had said. Finally, he spoke again, his voice low and measured. You mean to tell me that you used your blindness to outmaneuver the entire legal system? Theodore nodded. Not exactly. It wasn't my blindness that made me succeed. It was the system's assumption that it could control me. You see, Your Honor, the system has a way of marginalizing people like me. People who don't fit the typical mold. But in doing so, it misses something crucial. He paused, letting his words sink in. The system forgets that sometimes the most dangerous thing is not what someone has, but what they lack. I lack sight, but I don't lack insight. Judge Howard leaned forward, his elbows resting on the desk. And this insight, Mr. Dawson, what exactly does it reveal? Theodore's expression remained the same, calm yet intense. It reveals the flaws in your system. The cracks that people like you overlook because you're too focused on maintaining control. The system is supposed to be about fairness, about equality. But when it turns a blind eye to certain groups, when it assumes that those without power or resources can't fight back, it creates an opening. And I was lucky enough to find it. There was a moment of stunned silence as the gravity of Theodore's words began to settle over the room. Judge Howard couldn't look away from Theodore. The man standing before him wasn't just a blind defendant. He was someone who had learned to see through the system's illusions. The prosecution's attorney, Mr. Callahan, shifted uncomfortably in his seat. He had expected Theodore to falter, to make a mistake. After all, how could a blind man possibly understand the intricacies of the law? But Theodore had done something no one anticipated. He had outsmarted them all. So, you're telling me, Judge Howard said slowly, his voice tinged with disbelief, that a blind man, someone without sight, managed to draft a legal strategy that none of us saw coming. Theodore's lips parted slightly as he nodded, his smile never wavering. Yes, Your Honor. Exactly. For the first time, Judge Howard felt a deep, unsettling sense of unease. He had always prided himself on understanding the law, on being able to see through any trickery or deceit. But here he was, faced with a man who had outmaneuvered him, outwitted him, and exposed the very flaws of a system he had once thought flawless. I never asked for any of this, Your Honor, Theodore said, his voice taking on a quieter tone, almost as if he were speaking to himself. I never asked for my blindness. But I'd learned that the world doesn't always work in my favor, so I had to adapt. I had to find a way to navigate the world in a way that no one expected. He paused, looking down at the papers once more, as if the answer was right there in front of him, hidden in plain sight. I've spent my entire life learning how to see the things that others overlook, Theodore continued. The things that matter most. Judge Howard leaned back in his chair, the weight of the realization settling in. Theodore Dawson had not just outsmarted him. He had exposed a deeper truth about the world, a truth that Judge Howard would never be able to ignore again. The system wasn't perfect, and it never would be, not until it learned to see people like Theodore Dawson, not despite his blindness, but because of it. The silence in the room was deafening. Everyone seemed to be holding their breath, waiting for what would come next. Would Theodore continue to reveal his strategy, or would the next shocking turn of events leave them all in even greater disbelief? One thing was certain. Theodore Dawson had changed the game, and they hadn't even seen the first move yet. The silence in the courtroom felt like it could stretch on forever. Judge Howard leaned forward, his hands still trembling as he stared at Theodore Dawson. The reality of the situation was beginning to settle in. This was no ordinary case. Theodore wasn't just a blind man fighting for justice. He had become a symbol of something much larger, a reminder of how easily society overlooked the very people it claimed to protect. For a long time, people like Theodore had been written off as victims of their circumstances, victims of a world that didn't cater to their needs. Blindness was seen as a limitation, a disadvantage. But as Theodore stood in the heart of the courtroom, his confidence unshaken, it became clear. Limitations are only limitations if you let them be. Theodore's story wasn't just about outsmarting a system that had failed him. It was about demonstrating that true power doesn't come from what others can see, but from what lies beneath the surface. It's about using the tools we have in unconventional ways, finding strength in places others wouldn't even think to look. "You've exposed something, Mr. Dawson," Judge Howard finally said, his voice carrying the weight of deep reflection. "Something I've overlooked my entire career." Theodore didn't respond immediately. His eyes, hidden behind dark sunglasses, seemed to gaze beyond the judge, beyond the walls of the courtroom. He had already said everything that needed to be said. His actions, his unwavering belief in his own abilities, had already spoken louder than words ever could. "I've always believed that the law was about justice," the judge continued, his voice more thoughtful now. "But I realize now that it's about more than that. It's about equality, true equality. It's about recognizing that every person, regardless of their circumstances, has a right to be heard, to be understood, and most importantly, to be believed in." The room felt heavy with the realization that Theodore had just opened their eyes to a truth that they had never truly considered. The law had always been about rules, about right and wrong, but it had never been about understanding the heart of those who walked through its doors. Theodore had done more than just win a case. He had challenged the very foundation of the legal system. The courtroom, once filled with skepticism and doubt, now seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the final moment of truth. It was as if the world itself had shifted, and they were all witnesses to something transformative. Theodore Dawson, the blind man they had underestimated, had shown them that sight wasn't the only way to truly see. "You've won, Mr. Dawson," Judge Howard said, his voice calm but filled with respect. "Not just in this courtroom, but in something much bigger. You've shown us all that there is more than one way to navigate this world, and that sometimes the most powerful thing we can do is to believe in ourselves when no one else does." Theodore nodded, a quiet smile tugging at the corner of his lips. He didn't need to say anything more. The message had already been delivered, loud and clear. Believe in your own strength, even when the world tells you it's impossible. As he walked out of the courtroom, his footsteps confident and steady, Theodore knew that he had not only changed the course of his own life, but had sparked something in others. The world was full of barriers, some physical, some mental, some societal. But the most important thing Theodore had taught them all was this: barriers only exist in our minds. The message was simple, yet powerful. We all face challenges, we all face adversity. But it's not the challenges that define us. It's how we respond to them. Do we let the world's assumptions hold us back, or do we rise above them? Theodore Dawson had chosen to rise. And by doing so, he had shown the world what true strength looked like. His victory wasn't just a legal win. It was a victory for anyone who had ever been overlooked, underestimated, or told they couldn't succeed. It was a victory for those who dared to believe that they could change the world, even if the world didn't believe in them. As the doors of the courtroom swung closed behind him, Theodore Dawson's legacy had already begun. And it would be a legacy that would inspire countless others to see the world not for its limitations, but for its endless possibilities. Believe in yourself. See what others cannot see. And the world will change, one step at a time.